Good morning, everybody. My name is John Bash. I'm the United States Attorney here in the Western District of Texas. I'm just going to briefly introduce everybody behind me. From the Consumer Protection Branch of the Department of Justice, we have Deputy Assistant Attorney General David Morrell. We have the Director of the Consumer Protection Branch, Gus Eiler. You'll hear from both of them after me. We also have attorneys, Assistant Director of the Consumer Protection Branch, Vince Schuler. Trial attorneys Aaron Reynolds and Yolanda McCrae-Jones. And then from my office, we have Assistant United States Attorney Joseph Blackwell. We're here this morning to announce the unsealing of a 14-count indictment charging wire fraud, conspiracy, and aggravated identity theft against 5 co-conspirators for perpetrating a massive scheme targeted at United States veterans and other military-affiliated individuals. The co-conspirators used access to steal thousands of veterans' personal identifying information and used that information to attempt to steal, and in many cases to steal, either money from their bank accounts or to divert their benefits into the co-conspirators' controlled bank accounts. To our knowledge, this is the largest criminal case ever involving identity theft of military-affiliated personnel. We've identified over 3,000 victims so far, and we're not sure we're done identifying victims in this case. There were millions of dollars in either actual or attempted thefts. As I mentioned, this is a joint prosecution with DOJ's Consumer Protection Branch. They have been phenomenal. They have phenomenal attorneys there. They jumped on this case as soon as evidence came to the attention of the Department of Justice about this scheme, and very quickly put together the indictment and the evidence. All 5 co-conspirators have now been arrested. This is a major step, in my view, to protect veterans and also in our initiatives to combat elder fraud, as Attorney General Barr has spoken about so eloquently. Before I get into the details of the scheme, I'll just note the names of each of the defendants in this case. 3 of them are U.S. citizens. Robert Wayne Bowling, Jr. Was the mastermind of the scheme, as alleged in the indictment. He's a U.S. citizen residing in Angeles City, Philippines. The other 2 U.S. citizens were Frederick Brown from Las Vegas and Troris Crawford from San Diego. There were also 2 foreign nationals involved in this scheme, Alan Albert Kerr, an Australian national residing in Angeles City in the Philippines, and Jongmin Seok, a South Korean national also residing in Angeles City in the Philippines. Before I get into the details of the scheme, I'll just note all 5 of them are presumed innocent until they're proven guilty or they plead guilty. And so we should keep that in mind. We're not presenting evidence today, although we do have ample evidence of this scheme. We are just talking about charges in an indictment, and they're presumed innocent. The scheme really involved 3 steps. The first step was obtaining PII, personally identifiable information, from our nation's veterans, active duty personnel, and dependents. And that began in 2014 when one of the co-conspirators, Brown, used his position as a civilian medical technician in an army base in South Korea to obtain personally identifying information. Now, the way he did it, as alleged in the indictment, is that he had access to a healthcare database run by the Department of Defense called the Armed Forces Longitudinal Technology Application, AFLTA. And he would simply take a camera and take screenshots of PII contained in those records on his computer screen. And then he would send that to Bowling, who, as I mentioned, was the mastermind of the scheme and resided in the Philippines. They had been friends for a number of years. Brown was a medical records technician there from 2010 to 2015 when he got fired on unrelated grounds. As I mentioned, he took photographs and sent that to Bowling. Bowling then, with the 2 foreign nationals, Kerr and Seok, used that personally identifiable information to get into DOD and VA websites and databases in order to divert money from veterans and others into their own pockets. So the primary way they did that is they used the PII to access a Department of Defense portal called DS Logon. That portal allows Department of Defense members and employees and veterans to use a single username and password to access numerous internal websites for benefits and documents and stuff like that. So they used the information that Brown had stolen to get into the DS Login portal. They then accessed primarily one of those affiliated internal websites called eBenefits, which is run by the Department of Veterans Affairs, to get bank account information from each of these veterans and others who maintained eBenefits accounts, or in some cases they created new eBenefits accounts. eBenefits is run out of San Antonio. Its servers are here and its admin staff are here, so that's why this case is being prosecuted by our office in conjunction with the Consumer Protection Branch. Really, there were two ways in which the co-conspirators exploited the eBenefits website to steal from veterans. As I mentioned, the eBenefits website had bank account and routing numbers for the people who had signed up for accounts, so they did one of two things. Either they took the bank account and routing number in conjunction with other personal information that they had already acquired and just contacted their banks directly and were able to divert money from the veterans' bank accounts into their own pockets. And we'll talk a little bit about how they did that. But they just, in some cases, they even called the banks, and they would use call spoofing software, which made it look like the number was coming from the veteran's own phone number. And in some cases, they actually talked to bank officials and posed as the veterans. But with that bank account number and routing number and other information, they were able to divert money from the bank accounts into their own pockets. The other thing they did was actually just change the bank account and routing information in the eBenefits website to their preferred bank accounts so that the benefits would end up being paid directly to them or their co-conspirators and not to the veterans. So those are the two ways, or the primary ways, in which they exploited this personally identifiable information to steal money. We have ample evidence of this that we are ready to present. Some of it is referred to in the indictment that was unsealed and that you should have access to, including emails between the co-conspirators talking about the scheme. The indictment sets out 6 example cases, but of course we believe there are many more cases than that. The third phase of the scheme and the last phase was actually getting the money to the co-conspirators in the Philippines, and that's where Defendant Crawford, one of the American citizen defendants, comes in. He supervised what we in the law enforcement community often call money mules, which is other third parties who would accept the money from the veterans' bank accounts or from the benefits website into their own bank accounts and then would forward payments to the co-conspirators in the Philippines. It's a method of money laundering, essentially. And they use this money mule method to get the money to the Philippines, and Crawford would take a percentage as his fee for organizing this money mule scheme. So those were the 3 steps. Brown stole the personally identifiable information from the healthcare website. The co-conspirator used that to get into the bank accounts or benefits pages of victims, and then they used money mules to get it to the Philippines. That's all as alleged in the indictment, and I'll just say again that those are only allegations at this point, and each of the defendants are presumed innocent, but that is what the Department of Justice has alleged today. Arrests. Arrests in this operation started on August 5th. Bowling, Kerr, and Siok, the 3 who reside in the Philippines, have been arrested in the Philippines. We are now working with our colleagues to repatriate them, or to, in the case of the 2 foreign nationals, to extradite them. Brown was arrested in Las Vegas. Crawford was arrested in San Diego. They are expected to be arraigned next week. I should mention that the primary investigative agency who we've been working with and who has worked this case is the Defense Criminal Investigative Services, DCIS. They couldn't be with us here today, but we really thank them for their amazing work on this case and trying to get justice for our victims. Speaking of the victims, as I mentioned, we believe there are at least 3,300 victims who had their PII stolen. Now, they didn't all have their money stolen or their benefits stolen, but at least 3,300 that had their PII stolen. And maybe the most egregious aspect of this case is that the targets centered on disabled and elderly veterans. And we believe the reason for that is the co-conspirators believe that they would have the most benefits because you, of course, get disability payments for being disabled. My dad's a 100% disabled vet. And elderly victims they thought would be receiving more payments and benefits. They also targeted very senior military officers, we believe for the same reason, that they expected those officers to have the most money available to be stolen. DOJ intends to provide notifications to all victims through the Mega Victim Case Assistance Program. Victim resources will be made available to them. In addition, we expect that DOD and VA are going to be providing separate notifications to the victims. We understand that in many cases, if not most cases, the victims have been made whole, either by financial institutions or by DOD or VA. few takeaways from this prosecution before I turn it over to my colleagues from the Consumer Protection Branch. Our veterans were willing to risk everything to protect this country from foreign threats, and now they were being threatened by a conspiracy operating abroad. So it's our turn to repay their sacrifice and make sure we bring justice to them for having their information, in some cases their money, stolen by a foreign conspiracy. This is also, as I mentioned, an elder fraud case. Attorney General Barr has made elder fraud a priority. It's really just despicable to prey on people who are in the later stages of their life. This is a massive elder fraud case, and we intend to seek justice in conformity with Attorney General Barr's expectations in this area. Finally, I just want to mention our great colleagues from the Consumer Protection Branch of DOJ. It's kind of a secret weapon that DOJ has. Even though they're housed in the civil division, they actually do the majority of their work as criminal work. And they did a phenomenal job in this case, jumping on the information as quickly as possible, making sure that we protected veterans, but also making sure that we unraveled the entire scheme and could bring the primary wrongdoers to justice. So our work with the Consumer Protection Branch in this case has been phenomenal. I really appreciate everything they've done. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, who's in charge of the Consumer Protection Branch, David Morrell.
Thank you, John. So as John said, my name is David Morrell, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Consumer Protection Branch at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. I'm proud to be here to join my friend and colleague, U.S. Attorney Bash, in announcing this action that our offices have taken to stop the exploitation of our service members and veterans. As President Trump has stated, our country owes an immense debt to our service members, veterans, and their families. And as a nation, we honor their service and commitment and their sacrifice by ensuring them access to the benefits they've earned. It is in that same spirit that the Department of Justice has long committed to protecting America's service members and veterans from fraud and abuse. This is particularly true for those who are elderly and disabled. The Department of Justice, and especially its Consumer Protection Branch, is vigilant in its efforts to detect and deter such fraud. Rather than honoring the service members and veterans who sacrificed for them, the defendants charged today are alleged to have targeted those brave men and women in a years-long crime. Having gained unauthorized access to the personal information of thousands of military members, the defendants are accused of using that information to steal or attempt to steal millions of dollars. Working from overseas and within the United States, the defendants used sophisticated means to allegedly steal from military members' bank accounts and to redirect their service-related benefits. Particularly reprehensible was the defendants' express targeting of senior military personnel and older disabled veterans. Indeed, the defendants, to borrow their own words, saw big money in seeking to defraud disabled veterans. Such conduct is an affront to the United States, and as Attorney General Barr has said, it will not be tolerated. Through the actions announced today, the Department of Justice is making good on its commitment to protect our military members and veterans, and has showed that it will bring to justice those who would seek to harm them. We also proved the reach of American law enforcement and the strength of our partnerships. It didn't matter that 3 of the defendants in this case were halfway across the world. We found them and are ensuring that they will have their day in court. I want to thank my team at the Consumer Protection Branch for identifying and working up this case in record time, gathering evidence through more than 80 search warrants and reviewing literally hundreds of thousands of documents in mere months. They identified this fraud scheme and made this prosecution possible. I also want to thank the U.S. Attorney's Office for being such an outstanding partner and committing its resources and expertise to advancing this effort. I'm also grateful for the exceptional support and professionalism of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and Army agents who all investigated this case and collaborated with foreign colleagues to secure the evidence and to make the arrests. Lastly, I want to thank our partners at the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs. They've rendered extraordinary service and assistance in building this case, identifying victims, and taking steps to make our military members and their families even more secure. We're continuing to work together, and soon we'll be contacting all known victims to offer assistance. With that, I'd like to introduce the Director of the Consumer Protection Branch, Gus Eiler.
Good morning. Thank you, David and John. My name is Gus Eiler. I'm the Director of the Consumer Protection Branch at the Department of Justice. Based in Washington, D.C., the Consumer Protection Branch uses both criminal and civil tools to protect Americans' health, safety, and economic security. As part of that mission, we strive to protect U.S. service members and veterans from fraud and abuse. As our team built this case today, I was repeatedly struck by the callousness of the alleged defendants' conduct and their communications, lacking any regard for the military members that they were seeking to harm. The defendants were open about their aims. They were routinely targeting senior and disabled individuals who they viewed as likely to have more money to steal. Indeed, in one alleged communication, a defendant explained his conduct by saying, and I'm going to paraphrase here for public consumption, that I mess with veterans. Well, I'm proud to say that when you mess with veterans, you mess with the men and women of the Department of Justice and our law enforcement partners, and I believe that our actions taken today prove that we will go to any length to bring those wrongdoers to justice. Our Consumer Protection Branch team, I would like to thank Andy Clark, Vince Schuler, Aaron Reynolds, Yolanda McCroy-Jones, and Matt Freund. Three of them are here today. All three of them are military members themselves, current or former. They understand the significance of cases like this and have dedicated their professional lives to bringing victims justice. I also want to express my deep thanks to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I've had the distinct privilege of knowing and working with John Bash for many years, and I can say that the people of West Texas could not have a smarter, more capable, or more diligent U.S. Attorney. I'm also very grateful for the assistance of Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Blackwell, who's been exceptional on this case, and for all the other members of the U.S. Attorney's Office who have been such outstanding partners to us. Further, I'd like to praise the great work done by the law enforcement agents in working up this matter in what has really been record time. Agents from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, the United States Postal Inspection Service, the Army, and other agencies contributed enormously to this effort. They traveled across the globe, interviewed witnesses, and made this case quickly. I think that they did their country and their agencies proud. I'd also like to end by saying a word about the victims in this case. Identity theft and fraud, especially fraud against elderly Americans, is unfortunately all too common. It's for that reason that Attorney General Barr has recently announced that elder fraud is an administration priority goal, and he recently established the Transnational Elder Fraud Strike Force, which the Consumer Protection Branch leads, to combat that type of fraud. But I think that service members and veterans should be off limits even to the worst fraudsters, and seeking to exploit the systems that are designed to make their lives easier and help to repay their sacrifice is really just about as low as it can get. So working with the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Justice will be contacting the known victims in this case shortly, and we will continue to take all possible actions to detect, disrupt, and deter individuals from seeking to defraud American service members and veterans. Thank you.
So we can take some questions.
John, you said millions of dollars. Do you have any more concise amount of how it could be? Millions is pretty vague. $2 million, $200 million.
We don't. We're still accounting for all that, and so we don't have the precise numbers. We know we can say with confidence that they either stole or attempted to steal in the millions, but we don't have a more specific number at this point. And I wouldn't want to say anything without supreme confidence in it.
Mr. Bash, this is a giant case with many victims, and it is sprawling, vast how big this is. Was there one thing that broke this open, or how did this get broken open?
Well, I can say that we received information about the scheme earlier this year, not necessarily the identities of the co-conspirators, but the investigative agencies jumped on it immediately. The co-conspirators were identified earlier this summer, and then things moved very quickly to bring them to justice. As you can imagine, there are complexities when you're dealing with people residing abroad, when you're dealing with a conspiracy that operates online through the internet. So it's a challenging investigation in many respects, but these guys at Consumer Protection and the law enforcement colleagues, Postal, DCIS, were awesome at moving as quickly as possible when we got the information.
Did the tip come here or in the Philippines?
I don't want to get more into information because it could be evidence in the case, and I know sometimes when we do these press conferences on indictments, there's a lot of I can't comment on that, but we really got to be careful talking about evidence that could be presented in the case.
So why is the Western District of Texas the venue for this?
So as I mentioned earlier in my comments, the e-benefits website, which is the website that they primarily use to get bank account information from the victims, is housed here. Both its servers and its administrative staff are in San Antonio. So this was a natural venue for this prosecution.
And what law enforcement partners did you work with in the Philippines after the three that were there?
Gus, you
Yes,
can
so
take that.
we worked with 2 agencies in the Philippines. We worked with the Filipino National Bureau of Investigation. It's kind of like our version of the FBI. We also worked with Filipino immigration authorities who are assisting us with the apprehension and hopefully the swift rendition of the one American, Robert Bowling, who was detained there in the Philippines. We also are working with them on Mr. Kerr and Mr. Siak. Kerr is Australian and Siak is a South Korean citizen. So there'll be some kind of intergovernmental relations that will need to take place there. And I should say that the Department of State has also been a huge partner recently in working with us to identify individuals overseas.
My last question. You said that there were 6 people that were listed in the indictment. Do you have an idea about how many others? I know you said you're unsure there, but do you have a ballpark idea of how many people have been infected?
How many victims? So our ballpark figure right now on the number of victims whose PII, personally identifiable information, was stolen is 3,300. So that could change over time. You know, as you start learning more about a scheme, you might come into contact with more evidence that says it's significantly larger than that. But right now, 3,300. Now that doesn't mean 3,300 people whose money was stolen, but at least as far as we know now, 3,300 veterans or other military affiliated individuals whose personally identifiable information was stolen.
And
The way that this scheme first started, like I was able to take photographs or screenshots of the screen and then basically just forward that information to other people. Has anything been put in place to make sure that somebody's not able to do that in the future?
Well, I don't want to comment on what other agencies are doing, but I'm confident that DOD and VA are going to be taking significant steps to protect information in the future.
Mr. Beth, we're talking millions of dollars in this case with the conspirators, and they're living in the Philippines where I can only assume the dollar goes a little bit further. Can you tell me what sort of lifestyle Mr. Bowling was living in the Philippines?
No, I can't speak. I can't speak to his lifestyle in the Philippines.
You mentioned that because the majority of the victims were elderly or disabled, but they also targeted what they believe were senior military officers.
That's true.
If I'm thinking like a criminal, I'm thinking I want to hit the Joint Chiefs of Staff guy or the guy in the Department of Defense. Are these among your victims?
One thing we have to be really careful on in the Department of Justice is complying with all the victims' rights provisions of the statutes. They've been in the news a little bit lately. And so we're not going to talk about any names of victims because they have privacy rights, and I wouldn't want to, confirm or deny the victim was from this component or that component because they have privacy rights.
Could you tell us maybe the highest rank of some of these victims that you're aware of?
I'm going to stay very far away from getting in anything that could identify particular victims.
Do these defendants have a criminal history?
They do, to my knowledge. I'm not aware of the specifics, but drugs and...
yes, a number of the defendants do have criminal histories. Most of it involves drugs of some nature. Some of them do not, but none of it rises to the level that they're being accused of today.
The gentleman who worked for the Department of Defense was the origin of this PII.
He was charged and removed from Army employment, and I want to emphasize that he was a civilian employee of the Army, so not a U.S. soldier, and was removed from employment in part because of criminal activity in Korea, but activity related to alleged drug offenses and not fraud or the conduct associated with this case.
John, you said this started in 2014. Everything kind of started to get going, this investigation for a year. Was this going on for 4 years, for 5 years? What's the timeline for how long they were able
Leave that to Gus.
do?
Yeah, so what we have is the evidence shows that the information was first stolen in 2014. The defendants started using it to defraud individuals in 2015, and that conduct was occurring as recently as last week before we picked these individuals up. So this has been a long-running fraudulent scheme. The defendants took significant pains to hide it using VPN accesses, bouncing it through multiple different places. So tracking this one down took an immense law enforcement effort, and I think is a real credit to the agents and the teams that ultimately were able to connect the dots here and point back to these individuals in the Philippines and here in the United States.
Why don't we take 2 more questions?
Is there any way that veterans here can start to look at their finances and see if they were a victim of this? Because you've got 3,300, there could be more, but my grandfather, disabled veteran as well. Can I check to see if he was or was not a victim?
So first, all the victims we know about, we're going to notify it through a DOJ victim notification system. We're also going to put up on the web information that if you think you could have been a victim or you just want to know how do I check, that you can go and access that website. So we'll tweet that out and put that out to the press once it's ready to go. But we're going to have systems in place so people can check and determine if they may have been a victim. As I mentioned earlier, to our knowledge at this point, standing here today, most of the victims were made whole, either if their money was stolen from their financial institution, the financial institution made them whole, or if their benefits were stolen, DOD or VA made them whole. Standing here today, we believe that to be true. So we're hoping that there's not a lot of victims at the end of the day that are actually out dollars in their pockets. But we're going to work very closely with victims to make sure we do right by them, in addition to fulfilling this prosecution. One more question.
I want to get into identifying information. Can you tell us at least what parts of the country these veterans were from? Were they all from this area?
All over. The way in which they targeted veterans was not geographical. It was based on names or rank, disability, seniority. It wasn't based on I'm going to target San Antonio, I'm going to target Hawaii. So there are victims all over the country. So thank you very much for coming today. We really appreciate you covering this very important prosecution. Thank you.